In 1636, a Japanese man named Hamada Yahei tried to leave Japan. He was a merchant. He had been trading in Southeast Asia for years. He had contacts in Taiwan, relationships in Manila, a business that crossed oceans. The new government decided this was unacceptable. They brought him back. And then they made an example of him. This wasn't just one man's problem. In 1635, Japan's ruling shogun issued an order that would shape the country for the next 2 centuries. Japanese people were banned from leaving Japan. If you were caught trying to board a foreign ship, you could be executed. If you had already left and tried to return, you could be executed. If you built a ship large enough to cross the ocean, you could be executed. The law didn't just restrict travel. It erased the possibility of it. This was the beginning of what Japan would call Sakoku, the locked country. To understand why this happened, you have to understand what Japan looked like before it. In the early 1600s, Japan was not isolated. It was one of the most internationally connected countries in Asia. Japanese merchants traded across Southeast Asia. There were Japanese communities in the Philippines, in Thailand, in Vietnam. A man named Yamada Nagamasa had become such a powerful figure in Siam that the Thai king made him governor of a province. Japan was also receiving something far more disruptive than trade goods: Christianity. Portuguese missionaries had arrived in the 1540s. By 1600, there were hundreds of thousands of Japanese Christians, maybe 500,000. In some domains, the local lord had converted, and his people followed. The Tokugawa shogunate saw this as a direct threat. Christianity taught that there was a higher authority than the shogun. That was a problem. And foreign powers, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, were competing for influence in Japan through their missionaries and merchants. Then came the Shimabara Rebellion. In 1637, 30,000 Japanese Christians and starving peasants rose up against the local government on the Shimabara Peninsula. They held out for months in a castle. When the shogunate finally crushed the rebellion, they had to request help from a Dutch ship to do it. That was the last straw. The shogunate issued its final exclusion orders. Portuguese ships were banned entirely. The Portuguese ambassadors who came to negotiate were executed, all of them, except 13, who were sent back as messengers. The Dutch were allowed to stay, but under conditions that would have seemed humiliating to almost any other nation. The Dutch East India Company was given a small artificial island in Nagasaki harbor. It was called Dejima. It was 120 meters wide and 75 meters long. The shape of a fan. On this island, a maximum of 20 Dutch merchants and their staff were allowed to live. They were not allowed to leave without permission. They could not build churches. They could not display crosses. They could not bring their families. Once a year, the Dutch chief merchant was required to travel to Edo, a journey of several weeks, to pay respects to the shogun. They called this the hofreis, the court visit. The Dutch performed this ritual for over 200 years. In exchange for these conditions, they were the only Western power allowed to trade with Japan. The Chinese were also permitted to trade, in a designated area of Nagasaki. Koreans could trade through the domain of Tsushima. But no other contact was allowed. Japan had not simply closed its doors. It had installed a one-way mirror. It could observe the outside world when it chose to. The outside world could not observe Japan. What happened inside during those 2 centuries is genuinely strange. On one hand, Japan achieved something almost no other society has achieved for that length of time: peace. The Edo period had almost no major wars. The samurai class, an enormous portion of the population trained for combat, had almost nothing to fight. They became bureaucrats. They wrote poetry. They practiced sword techniques that they would never use. The population grew. Cities expanded. Edo, Tokyo, became one of the largest cities in the world, with over 1 million residents by the 18th century. A uniquely Japanese culture emerged. Kabuki theater. The woodblock prints that would later inspire Van Gogh and the Impressionists. Haiku. The tea ceremony formalized into something close to its modern form. When you cut yourself off from outside influence, you don't stop developing. You just develop differently. But the cost was real. While Japan was at peace, the rest of the world was not. Europe industrialized. Steam engines were invented. Electricity. Rifles. Navigation technology. Medicine. Chemistry. The entire scientific revolution happened largely without Japan's participation. The Dutch book's Rangaku, Dutch Learning, gave some Japanese scholars a window into Western science. Some of them understood what they were seeing. A doctor named Sugita Genpaku translated a Dutch anatomy textbook in 1774, because Japanese medical understanding was still based on ancient Chinese texts that were, in crucial ways, wrong. He described the experience of seeing a real human dissection for the first time, comparing it to the Dutch diagram in his textbook. Everything matched. Everything the Chinese text said would be there wasn't. He spent years translating the Dutch book with almost no knowledge of Dutch, working from diagrams and inference. The book he produced, the Kaitai Shinsho, became one of the most important medical texts in Japanese history. And it was a translation of a European textbook from 1734. Japan was learning about the world through a single tiny crack. Then, in 1853, the crack was forced open. Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy arrived in Edo Bay with 4 warships, 2 of them steam-powered, something Japan had never seen. The ships were painted black. They could move without wind. Their guns were larger than anything the Japanese coastal defenses could respond to. Perry carried a letter from the President of the United States. He wanted Japan to open its ports to American ships for refueling and trade. He left and said he would return the following year for an answer. The shogunate had no good options. Japan's 200 years of isolation had produced stability and culture. It had not produced the industrial and military technology to resist a modern navy. When Perry returned in 1854 with 8 ships, Japan signed the Convention of Kanagawa. Ports opened. Then more ports. Then foreign diplomats arrived. Then unequal treaties that gave Westerners legal immunity on Japanese soil. Within 15 years, the Tokugawa shogunate, which had ruled Japan since 1600, was gone. The Meiji Restoration that followed was one of the most deliberate national transformations in history. Japan didn't just open. It sent delegations across Europe and America to study everything: governments, factories, schools, armies, hospitals. It changed its legal system, its military structure, its currency, its calendar. Within 30 years, Japan was fighting wars against China and Russia and winning. The same country that had made leaving a crime had become one of the most internationally engaged nations in the world. But the question that haunts the Edo period is not whether Sakoku worked. It gave Japan 200 years of internal peace. That is not nothing. That is, by some measures, extraordinary. The question is what it cost. Japan had scholars who understood exactly what Western science could offer. They just weren't allowed to get it directly. Japan had merchants who had built trading networks across Southeast Asia. Those networks were cut off. Japan had Christians who had converted in good faith. They were forced to recant, driven underground, or executed. The decision was made by men who were afraid of losing control. That fear wasn't irrational. Christianity really was being used by European powers as a tool of soft influence. Foreign trade really did create dependencies and vulnerabilities. But the solution they chose, 200 years of locked doors, meant that when those doors finally opened, Japan was facing a world that had changed beyond recognition. And it had to catch up. In less than 50 years.